Exciting to be here and to hear some of the presentations. Always great to see the socio-technical solutions being developed. For example, with the cryptoeconomics, rather than a focus just on the technical layers. To manage expectations, although I do have a master's in financial economics, it's a long time ago, and I'm not going to be offering any killer solutions for governance or regulation in the DeFi space. What I am hoping to do is, I guess, much in the spirit of what Mathieu was just saying and his question earlier on about the hard divide between decentralization and institutions, that there are middle grounds to think about in that world. So to start that conversation, I'll just raise the provocation that in the crypto world, I think dreaming big means thinking beyond just DeFi and the applications of finance through tokens. I think it means finding ways to make public goods scale up more effectively. Now, Vitalik of Ethereum last year, I think it was, published an article in which, to paraphrase, he highlights the need for a move beyond liberalism to plurality. Now, that itself is a concept he's borrowing from Audrey Tang and Glenn Vale. But the path that he sets out for that is very much through establishing public goods through digital means. He talks about identity and, by extension, in the sort of circles version of the world, rights of individuals through interactions. He talks about voting systems that are inclusive of minority interests, not just dominated by the loudest, biggest group. He talks about conversations in order to form consensus as an essential part of governance. And he talks about institutions, including ownership of value, for example, IP, operating across multiple different scales, balancing local and global interests. He also talks about fractals, and he's quite sort of brief on that, but hopefully I can expand a bit on that later on and flesh out maybe some of what he might be thinking, what Glenn Vale might be thinking when they talk about that. Now, crucially, that wasn't my provocation. I'm just a public servant. I do what I understand the public is asking me to do through our institutions, which aren't all necessarily big and evil, as some of our panelists may have suggested. Right now, I'm Scotland's Chief Data Officer. I have only a sideline in blockchain and decentralization. My main responsibilities are around the reuse of data across public services, in which context we are doing some exploration of privacy-enhancing cryptography and within that decentralization of ownership. I'm also responsible and have been responsible for AI across Scotland. And I'm responsible for data in open government, which includes some work we're doing on innovations in democratic process, which I'll touch on again later on. And before that, I pioneered data science and AI across UK government for a decade or so. The point to highlight within that was, again, a bit of a sideline, wherein I helped coordinate a community of practice for DLT and blockchain for a number of years, trying to raise the basic expertise or understanding across the UK government of blockchain as a decentralization technology. Now, originally, I got into all of this from a complexity economics PhD, where I was modeling centralized and decentralized institutions. And it was that interest in institutions and the desire for a practical understanding of how they work that led me to sort of go into government. And I'd just like to highlight some of the stuff that governments around the world have been doing for quite a long time to support the development of decentralization technologies, and to some extent working towards some of those ideals that Vitalik was talking about. So back in 2016, I helped the chief scientific advisor for the UK government with I think one of the first reports by a government on blockchain around the world. Since then, although I wouldn't say I necessarily agree with all of the conclusions within it, since then we've seen other innovations in the UK, FCA sandboxes, for example, with the offer of support for innovations around blockchain and decentralization. Now, obviously, that's an evolving offer, and I suspect those who are working with it will obviously hope for it to develop further and further. We've seen the EU Commission for a number of years operating various deep dive analyses and reports over potential applications of blockchain, and they have been operating a sandbox for some time. In the US, more recently, we've seen attempts to actually base operational services on blockchain, whether that's the DMV in California or land records in a county in New Jersey. And in Scotland, via our CivTech commercial innovation program, we've got a number of different projects which try to use blockchain for public good applications. For example, Credit Nature, which is a natural capital accounting system based on blockchain. Not strictly blockchain, but it's in the theme of Vitalik's call for plurality before. Our work with a startup called Crownshy on deliberative democratic process and other participatory processes which speak to that ambition for scalable conversations as a basis for institutions. And then what's not on this slide is the Scott Account digital ID program in Scottish Government, which is inspired by and builds on the DID VC standards from the W3C Foundation, but which is recently being enhanced through CivTech with mechanisms for vouching for identity rather than relying on traditional identity processes. In that way, perhaps trying to reflect the relations-based identity that Vitalik was talking about, which I believe is part of the basis of circles from Gnosis. I should add, it was in that sort of work for the UK government coordinating that community of practice that I met Vitalik and various of the Ethereum founders, as well as founders of Gnosis some time ago. Now, I think even more relevant to those conversations about decentralized public goods are some of the research, the public research that's been done over the years in the UK. So I helped play a role in allocating research funding from the UK Funding Council towards research on decentralized voting, on decentralized identity, on immutable public records spread across multiple archival organizations, so decentralized. Some other projects we've seen funded through UK research are Playwright, which is about decentralized film rights, and Cedison, which was about P2P energy trading, trying to lay the foundations for obviously a system that is more compatible with the increasingly decentralized production and volatile production of energy that we see compared to the ecosystem that our national grid was originally developed for. And there's a lot more. You can go through the archives of the UKRI and find dozens and dozens of projects oriented towards blockchain and decentralization. Now, most recently, some of the stuff I've seen being done with UK research funding has included Decade. So I sat on the advisory board for this initiative, largely between Surrey and Edinburgh University, which has had outputs such as the CTPA media provenance standards, which is an open standard now used by, I think, pretty much all of the major players in fingerprinting and keeping track of digital content. One of the tools for fighting misinformation and misappropriation of images. But on top of that, decade of proposed mechanisms for decentralized content attribution, so ways in which the IP owners of content, including stuff that's been used as training of generative AI models, can stake some claim in the reuse of their IP later on. Really innovative stuff. And entirely in line, I think, with some of the propositions that Vitalik was talking about in terms of adapting our approach to the ownership of IP. And then Origen is another project out of Decade that's trying to help, I think, with that issue that was highlighted earlier of the fairly narrow part of the population that can really engage with crypto meaningfully by developing tools that help the public start to get their heads around things like content provenance when it's recombined assets and things like that. Now, Decade are moving on now to, I think, another very, very interesting aspect of decentralization that I've not heard too much coverage of today, and which I think is worthy of study in the cryptoeconomics space, and that's reputation, the basis for a lot of the online economic activity that we see today, where it's not cost effective to resolve things through centralized enforcement, and yet these decentralized mechanisms based on reputation are often controlled by a monopoly centrally. The other stuff going on, which I've maybe unreasonably grouped under the Digital Trust Task Force, is the Centre of Excellence in Digital Trust and DLT in Scotland, which brings together 3 world-leading institutions for blockchain research, and has been doing some very exciting things, among which I will just highlight the Edinburgh Decentralization Index, which may have been raised already today, but I highlight it because it is core to any conversation about decentralization to actually have a clear definition of what that means and a way in which to differentiate things which are superficially decentralized from things which are more fundamentally decentralized and avoid the difficulties introduced by concentrations of power over elements of those processes. There's also a commercial challenge that's been put out by the Digital Trust Task Force around innovative solutions for the energy transition. And there was an international conference put on, which partnered with a conference in Istanbul, has obviously been kind of drawing voices from around the world together to focus on innovations in digital trust. Now, I think the main message I want to put across in all of that is that public money is one way that we innovate and move forward on some of these challenges around decentralization, and that central institutions don't need to be and generally aren't antagonistic to decentralization, that generally everybody is trying to achieve the same things, and it's a question of understanding what the mechanisms are and the best tools are for different public goods. In terms of what crypto offers to this world, I see personally ICOs as a mechanism to draw funding to public good projects that aren't subject to the same bottlenecks as political process, which is limited by what can feature in the in public kind of discourse, and which don't get trapped in monopolistic prices if they've been developed as a proprietary solution to that public good problem. NFTs, again, I personally view positively. I see it as a way in which traditional funding model of patronage for creatives gets updated to a world and becomes scalable, so that it can be applied to all kinds of situations where it's hard to control the redistribution of whatever's being produced, which applies to quite a lot of assets nowadays, products. I think in both these cases, the abiding concern for me is just whether what are loosely referred to as markets can be trusted to bring the wisdom of the crowds to bear against which of these public good propositions get resources put behind them and which of them don't. And that's where I'm going to come back around to fractals and talk about collective intelligence and how I think that is actually precisely about finding that balance between centralized institutions and a completely peer-to-peer, decentralized approach to the world. So in some of my work within UK government, looking at organizational design and the kinds of collaboration patterns between individuals which are conducive to productivity, to innovation, but also to getting stuff done. I found that a lot of the literature on collective intelligence falls short in terms of encouraging agile style working, very bottom-up solutions, without recognizing where those fail as a coordination mechanism. And similarly, traditional hierarchical approaches to organizing people, I also found had their limitations in certain organizational settings. So this all pushed me down the path of looking for solutions for helping people collaborate to make the best use of all of their intelligence, which are neither relying entirely on decentralization or on hierarchical centralization. And what I came to from that was the recognition that if we think of communication of ideas a bit like viruses spreading, which only a few years ago we all had to get our heads around fairly quickly, the communicability of different ideas very much corresponds to an R number in disease transfer, and that can vary a lot. Now, what we see mathematically is that it's only for very specific communicability of ideas that you can rely on careful control of whether that idea spreads across the whole system or not. And I don't mean central control, I mean group level control. So you have this sweet spot for how easily people can access an idea in order for it to get sense checked as it spreads across society or across your organization in my original context. If you're below that sweet spot, if the idea is harder to communicate than that for the average person, then it's not going to spread at all. It's going to get locked into echo chambers. You're probably going to see a lot of groupthink and solutions to problems that aren't drawing on everyone's knowledge and which ultimately fall down when they're tested in practice. If it's more communicable than that, then you might find yourself in a situation where everyone is just overwhelmed constantly with noise from all sides because the filter mechanisms aren't working to stop ideas from spreading around. Now, if we think of people collaborating as a network, so where there's a line between individuals in this particular diagram in the middle there, where they are collaborating, then there's a particular network structure that we see quite prolifically. We see it in information processing systems on all scales, so human brains, protein activation networks, social groups, the World Wide Web, which mathematically, when you look at it in terms of a contagion process, the spread of ideas, let's say, has this very, very desirable property that it spreads out that sweet spot into a sweet zone. So you can have, for a whole range of different ideas, a controlled spread of that, a filtering between groups. Now, that means that what I would call, to elaborate on the collective intelligence idea of teams of teams, what I would call teams of teams of teams, or you could say fractal teams, that these are introducing something like the information processing properties of the brain to groups of individuals. And I see that as a recipe for collective intelligence. In terms of the practical relevance of that, you might think, for example, of decentralized social networks and what kind of architectural features you introduce to those to help them tackle the challenges of our time, balancing the prevalence of disinformation and misinformation and extremism with the need for us as a society to share new ideas and learn collectively, so that a decentralized social platform might introduce the right fees and subsidies for users to encourage them into a collaboration pattern that matches that fractal team of teams structure. Applied to marketplaces and reputation, as I highlighted before, one of the problems with peer-to-peer reputation is that some peers have a lot of reputation and some peers don't, and that leads to asymmetric power when they're interacting. Tit for tat doesn't work if the person you're downvoting has 1,000 votes and you only have one. That's going to wipe out your reputation. It's barely going to matter to them. Now, fractal structures get us to a place where we can reasonably expect peers with equal amounts of reputation, equal contributions to their reputation to be interacting as proxies for members of communities, or as proxies for their whole community. So without getting into the specifics of the Dunbar number, we might hopefully be able to scale reputation systems to be effective way beyond their constraints in social settings. So recognizing that I'm probably over time from Mathieu's poised positioning in the room, I'll come back around. On that provocation that I set out at the start, the invitation that I would put out to the DeFi community is to think beyond DeFi, to think of decentralization for other platforms that might underpin social goods more widely. Not everywhere, only where it avoids the abuse of monopoly powers. I'd encourage everyone to think beyond technical designs, to think of socio-technical solutions. That could be applying ideas from mechanism design. It could be applying broader models of human behavior, evolutionary game theory, for example. And I'd encourage everyone to think in terms of collective intelligence, which ultimately, I think, addresses our real long-term challenges, which are, as a society, we don't know what the problems we will be facing in the next 50 years are. And we only know that by using everyone's knowledge as effectively as possible together. And then last of all, I'd encourage people in this community, which is sometimes opposed to central institutions, to do as I've done and get more involved with central institutions, come to understand how they operate more. Just maybe a thinly veiled recruitment pitch. But thank you all for your time. Hopefully that's been interesting. So, at the podium? Yeah, the podium.
Right, I'm going to ask a question. I guess it might or might not be a competing concept, but are you familiar with the Balaji's network state? You know, okay. I mean, it's a slightly different concept, but basically then it's the whole state emerges. In fact, also organically, there's something organic as a structure. It doesn't have a, well, I guess, luggage or heritage. It's kind of, or is basically like almost like planted, like a crystal. It's like crystallized. Yes, actually, I think so. There's some interesting ideas there, but yeah. Okay, we actually have. Okay, does anyone have? We can have one question. Yeah.
Hiya. I was curious about, I think it was your second or third to last slide, you said about disincentivizing disinformation. And I was wondering, what is the process for determining what is disinformation? Like your presentation was about decentralization, and that seems to me to be a very centralized concept. Who determines what disinformation is? If you look back at 2020, people who were censored then for saying certain things were actually proven to be correct. So I'm wondering, how does that process fit into it?
I think it's a great challenge. And I mean, this is essentially what I spend a lot of time saying within government on conversations about misinformation and disinformation. You know, first of all, and even to your point about things being proven to be correct, as a philosopher of science, we don't have any tools for proving that things are correct in sort of some ideal sense. We only have shifting consensus. Now, everything I'm proposing there about having platforms that allow us to have a healthy degree of interaction between collections of people at different scales, which could be the scale of a nation, but it could also be the scale of a region, or it could be the scale of a special interest group. It's about allowing the local control of the spread of information in order to make sure that we're not all overwhelmed by a meme that is superficially appealing, but once it's bounced around within a group of people and has some sense making applied to it, is clearly fallacious, and therefore doesn't then get spread on to adjacent communities. So it's not about deciding what's true and what isn't true. Even as a data scientist, I don't know how we would do that technologically, and I certainly wouldn't ask large language models to do it. It's about making sure that the way in which information flows around society is conducive to local sense making at a continuum of different scales, so that information only gets shared when it's been reconciled with the world models of everyone involved in that community at that scale. Does that make sense?